Hi, Phil Swift here for
HoWA.
this.
Really broken endgame gloves.
This is probably one of the best builds I've ever played in Path of Exile 2 and Path of Exile 1. My Hand of Wisdom in action, Pillar of the Cage God, Intelligence and Dexterity stacking Tempest Flurry Gemling Legionnaire, with Mind Over Matter, Chaos Inoculation, and Eldritch Battery is truly a well-rounded beast. It can clear entire screens, move faster than you would in Path of Exile 1, and kill uber bosses in seconds. All in all, it's my favorite build of early access, both in power and quality of life, and with last Sunday's announcements, I think it's safe to say that the build is fine for the next month or so before Path of Exile 2's first league. Before we get started, for everyone who's coming from my previous showcase video, as you can see we've gotten a few upgrades, the most notable being a full cosmetic inventory, courtesy of my lovely wife. This has given me the buff to grow my brain another 60 or so intelligence and achieve level 96. There's still plenty more investment and work to be done with the build, so please look forward to more build updates in the future. Starting off, the core of the build revolves around two synergistic uniques, Hand of Wisdom in action and Pillar of the Cage God. Both uniques scale damage off of stacking attributes, which synergizes extraordinarily well with Gemling Legionnaire's Enhanced Effectiveness Ascendancy node, which doubles inherent bonuses from all attributes. This allows us to scale both offensive and defensive layers as we get more intelligence and dexterity. For intelligence, we get flat lightning damage from Hand of Wisdom in action and more area of effect from Pillar of the Cage God, allowing us to get some crazy herald chains. We also scale an insanely high hit pool with Mind Over Matter since we're getting 4 mana per intelligence. For dexterity, we just get a lot of speed, like an insane amount of speed. We're quadruple dipping attack speed modifiers, since Hand of Wisdom in action, Pillar of the Cage God, and Falcon Technique on the tree all scale attack speed with dexterity. On top of that, Falcon Dive also scales attack speed off of accuracy rating, which is the inherent bonus of dexterity, which is then getting doubled by Gemling Legionnaire. Pairing this with a skill like Tempest Flurry, which scales movement speed off of attack speed, essentially makes the movement speed on my boots completely useless. And as a side note, I guess we also do stack a decent amount of strength just off of having a bunch of all attribute modifiers on my gear. Pillar of the Cage God scales attack damage per 5 strength. So everything put together, these are all the different bonuses I'm getting just from stacking attributes. Moving on, it's time to talk about some quality of life solutions that I have with the build. For point efficiency, I have 2 different jewel setups. The first is a controlled metamorphosis that saves me 11 points when going for 3 high value notables. Make sure that you're looking for a massive ring size since any other ring size will not work. My second setup is an Against the Darkness and From Nothing pairing in the Resonance Keystone area. This allows me to grab 5 extra notables, 3 of which provide stats that I want on top of the Against the Darkness bonuses. With this Resonance setup, I get 24% increased intelligence and dexterity, which is an insane scaler for the build. When it comes to gearing efficiency, I opt into Chaos Inoculation to become Chaos Immune. While that does mean I lose about 3000 life, it makes gearing extraordinarily easy since I don't have to worry about Chaos Res, especially considering the Chaos Resistance penalties from Controlled Metamorphosis and Spaghettification. For Elemental Resistances, I run a 5-socket, all-attribute, all-elemental resistance Warrior Invictus with socketed Elemental Resistance Soul Cores. This single item gives me 25% increased all attributes and 75% increased all elemental resistances. I also run 3 Grand Spectrum Sapphires, which gives me 36 total all res, and 2 additional elemental resistance soul cores on my gear. This totals to exactly 75% all res, after all penalties, and allows me to greed attributes on every other piece of gear that I have. For mapping, this build abuses Herald Chaining better than any other attack build, due to Pillar of the Cage God giving an absurd amount of area of effect. For those who don't know, Herald Chaining works by making Herald of Thunder freeze and Herald of Ice shock, allowing them to chain together and off-screen entire mobs. While Deadeyes might need other notables on the tree, we simply have so much damage on our Heralds that a Cold Infusion on Herald of Thunder will freeze, and our base damage on Herald of Ice will shock. These additional freezes also allows us to run Combat Frenzy and Resonance to generate power charges while mapping, to sustain a charge staff that gives us Electrocute, Culling Strike, and range that scales off of area of effect from Pillar. I also generate Rage while mapping off of Rage on hit jewels that I socket in my extra jewel slots. On the defensive end, I focused on making sure I can run every single map modifier. I spend 2 points on the tree to get 1 extra charm slot so that I can run a stun and freeze charm. We spend 1 extra point that gives us attributes and protection from crits, and Chaos Inoculation inherently makes us immune to both bleed and poison. We're also sitting at a pretty high hit pool of 7.8k mana, which we sustain with a 2% mana on kill jewel, and a Melting Maelstrom unique flask in very dire situations. This mana flask is actually so broken that I've gotten worse at the game since I no longer care about on-death effects, or boss mechanics. For bossing, I mostly focus on ease of play. We use Hand of Chayula to use one button to apply Voltaic Mark and Conductivity. We also get mana and rage regen off of Font of Mana and Font of Rage linked to an Orb of Storms. We use a Cast on Shock instead of Heralds to proc an Eye of Winter that applies critical weakness. Once everything is down, just spam Tempest Spell and Tempest Flurry until the boss is dead. I would also like to take some time to talk about gear progression, especially since most pieces are pretty expensive. The build works with just the Hand of Wisdom in action and Pillar of the Caged God. While Hand of Wisdom in action is a couple divines, Pillar of the Caged God is extraordinarily cheap. If you do have some extra currency, I recommend getting an attack speed corruption on Pillar to hit the 1.65 attack speed cap on that item. Attack speed is one of the best feeling stats to get on this build, and I would not recommend switching to Tempest Flurry until you have about 8 attacks per second. Until that point, I would use Ice Strike. After getting those two uniques, gearing is actually really flexible. I would look for cheap rares with attributes and resistances, and I would mostly focus on stacking strength and intelligence instead of intelligence and dexterity, and stay away from Mind Over Matter until later. From this point on, I would recommend going for Grand Spectrum Jewels and a Warrior Invictus so that you can get your elemental resistances in order. Keep in mind that a 4-socket Warrior Invictus is just 15 elemental resistance lower than a 5-socket and considerably cheaper. At this point, I would consider fully swapping to Mind Over Matter and looking for incremental upgrades to increase your attributes. A good example of this would be a Black Sun Crest instead of an Astromantis. While an Astromantis might spike you harder, a Black Sun Crest is a fraction of the cost. Farming for an endgame item on very minimal gear will take longer and be less fun. Another good example of this would be upgrading from regular rings to breach rings. This would also allow you to consider buying an Ingenuity, which will scale your breach rings even harder. I hope everybody gets to play this build before it's gone, and enjoy it just as much as I do. Please feel free to reach out to me in-game if you have any questions regarding the build. There's also a max roll in the description with the full passive tree, gem setup, and gear set. As for my immediate goals, I'm farming up for an Adorned, and I will update the tree whenever I get it. And with that, I'm going to leave you guys with a juiced T17 10 breach map, and I'll see y'all in the next one.